Well, we're in week 3 of a series, Sticking It to the Man. If you're visiting with us today, we're taking a look at what it means to bring God and our faith into the workplace. And as we begin, let me ask you a question. Anyone ever been discouraged at work? I mean, come on, right? If you've had a job like ever, or if you have any sort of job, doesn't matter what you do, you've been there. We get to a point sometimes in work where we're just ready to be done. We're ready to throw in the towel. We're ready to call it quits. We're tired. We're frustrated. We feel like it's pointless. And by the way, the job place is not the only place that this happens. We experience this in relationships. You know, times where you just, man, I just can't make this thing work. We experience it when we're dealing with health issues. We experience it when we're in school and get near the end of the semester, or in physical fitness, in finances. We experience this when we're raising kids, we're parenting. All of these places, we can get to the end of our rope. But the whole workplace, the work situation is notorious for this, right? And so Steve Deneff is a pastor of a church called College Wesleyan Church in Marion, Indiana. He's a friend of mine, and he did a series on work back in 2013 where he shared some pretty stunning statistics. He said in the United States, as of 2013 anyway, 11.5 million people were unemployed in the United States. When you add to that those who have given up even looking, the numbers go even higher. Now add to that we're kind of on this cultural fault line, if you will. The landscape of our workforce is changing and will look fundamentally different 10 to 15 years from now, even than it does today. 80% of our current workforce is either in sales of some sort, management of some sort, or some job that requires a professional degree. We're shifting more and more away from manufacturing, and now at this point, less than 3% of our gross national product comes from agriculture, which is hard to believe. And the result of that is we have tons of people who have amazing skills that they can't find a job, and yet they're too young to retire. They're stuck in this kind of middle place. You add to that the changes in the law around benefits and those types of things that have turned us into what I call a part-time country. Now it's very hard to find a 40 hours a week plus benefits type job. Most people have to work 2 29-hour-a-week, no benefit jobs just to make ends meet. You add to that, there are a whole crew of people who are working because they're not working, because they found they could actually make more money by not working than they can by working. And you add all these things together, and it leads to a precipitous fall in motivation and in work ethic. Translation, work has become discouraging. For so many people, it's become a place of discouragement, which is really, really sad. And you may say, why are we talking about this in church? Well, this is a more spiritual issue than you could ever imagine. Peggy Noonan writes for the Wall Street Journal, and in 2013 she wrote the following words that summarize well. She said, "We see joblessness as an economic fact. We talk about the financial implications of unemployment. That isn't wrong, but it misses a central point. Joblessness is a personal crisis because work is a spiritual event." What does she mean by that? Well, discouragement in the workplace doesn't just affect the American economy, it affects our very hearts, our very souls. Let me ask you a question. Did work come before or after the fall of man? A lot of people will say what came after. No, it came before. So many approach work as if, well, work is a result of the fall. Like we were doing okay, and then Adam and Eve sinned, and the world fell, and now we have to have jobs. Like that's how that went down. No, that's not how it went down at all. In Genesis chapter 2, verse 15, before the fall, it says, the Lord God placed the man in the Garden of Eden to tend it and to watch over it. In other words, he put him in the Garden of Eden and he gave him a job to do. So if we're spiritual creatures made by God for labor, then what happens in our relationship with God and with others when our very workplace becomes a place of discouragement rather than a place of life? And yet that's where many people find themselves. A few months ago in our sermon, Love Where You Work, we made this comment: work is not a consequence of the fall, but meaningless work is. Discouraging work is. So how do we balance that reality with Paul's call in Colossians chapter 3, verse 17, where he says, "And whatever you do or say, do it as a representative of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks through him to God the Father." How do we work in a discouraging workplace and do it in a way that's representative of the Lord, giving thanks to him? Well, that's what I want to address today. So turn with me to Nehemiah chapter 4. If you're using one of our Bibles, we'll be on page 291. If you want to follow along, but you didn't bring a Bible, you can raise your hand. The ushers are coming around now, and they'd be willing to give you a Bible, and you can just flip to 291 and follow. If you don't own a Bible, please raise your hand. We'll just give you this as a gift. We want you to have God's word in your life. But Nehemiah chapter 4, page 291. As we continue to walk through Nehemiah, we get to chapter 4, and it's like so far so good. Nothing terrible has gone wrong. Chapter 1, we read about God wrestling with Nehemiah and Nehemiah's prayer about, like, should I do this or should I not do this? Chapter 2, Nehemiah begins to reveal his plan to other people. In chapter 3, we talked about how to work well with others and the beginning of the rebuilding of the wall. And by chapter 4, everything seems to be going well. And then all of a sudden, everything goes wrong at once. Anyone ever heard of Murphy's Law? If something can go wrong, it will, right? Well, where did that come from? It came from a guy who was really named Murphy, and he was an engineer who conducted experiments to test human acceleration tolerances. And so just by virtue of what he was studying, it cost a lot of money, and there were lots of gadgets and lots of data, right? Well, he did all of his tests before he realized that all 16 of his motion sensors were mounted backwards, and he had no results. And that's when they coined the phrase, like, apparently, if it can go wrong, it will. It's Murphy's Law. And that seems to be happening in Nehemiah chapter 4. Because one of the greatest tools in Satan's toolbox is a tool we call discouragement. Discouragement is like a disease. Okay? The disease, it's a disease that's running rampant in our culture. Symptoms include things like feelings of hopelessness, lack of desire to put forth any effort, readiness to throw in the towel and just quit. It's universal in that none of us is immune to it. It's reoccurring, meaning that being discouraged one time doesn't mean that you'll never be discouraged again. You're not inoculated to it. You don't become immune. It's also highly contagious. It spreads by casual contact. If you're around somebody who's discouraged, odds are you'll become discouraged. So today we're going to talk about 2 lessons about defeating discouragement in your life. And the first one I think you already know. You don't have to look for discouragement. It will find you. You ever notice that in your life? I don't think I told you something you don't know. We know this truth all too well. Discouragement seems to stalk us throughout life, and it seems like when we get around the corner, we finally escaped, it rears its head somewhere else in our lives, right? Now, we know that's the case, but what we don't always pay attention to is where the discouragement is coming from, which is really important in overcoming it. See, some discouragement comes from without. It comes from people around us, external sources. So let's jump in Nehemiah chapter 4, verse 1 through 3. Sanballat was very angry when he learned that we were rebuilding the wall. He flew into a rage and mocked the Jews, saying in front of his friends and the Samaritan army officers, "What does this bunch of poor, feeble Jews think they're doing? Do they think they can build a wall in a single day by just offering a few sacrifices? Do they actually think they can make something of these stones from a rubbish heap, and charred ones at that?" Tobiah the Ammonite, who was standing beside him, remarked, "That stone wall would collapse if even a fox walked along the top of it." Now, obviously, there's some external influence going on here. Sanballat, as you will see if you read Nehemiah, is not a super nice guy. And it says he flew into a rage and he began to mock the Jews. I went back, the literal translation, I think in Hebrew, the literal translation is, and he started talking smack. I think that's, but ridicule is truthfully one of the enemy's oldest weapons. And the reason he likes it so much is because ridicule needs absolutely no factual ammunition. It doesn't have to be true at all. You just have to say it a lot and say it loud, and people will believe you. And that's what Sanballat is doing, and he asks several questions. He says, what do they think they're doing? Do they think they can offer just a few sacrifices, and are they going to pray the wall up? Is that just going to happen automatically? Because that would be their only hope. Do they have any idea how big of a project this is? Do they have any idea how much rubble there's, how many stones there are? Do they know how bad these stones are? And then in verse 3, Tobiah adds like that, aw, snap. He says, that thing would crumble if a fox walked on it. Like, oh, snap, buddy. And really, it's kind of a two-pronged attack. It's like saying this wall is still so low that a fox can get up on it, a fox can jump it, and it's so poorly built that if a fox jumped up on it, the whole thing would crumble. And so they're just like laying it on thick, okay? And by the way, we see this all through Scripture. It's not just limited to this story. David and Goliath, right? David goes out to fight him. Goliath says, "What am I a dog that you come at me with a little stick? Like, what are you doing?" I mean, he's just talking smack, And then even during Jesus' crucifixion, the soldiers, they would cover his face and hit him. And they'd say, "Who hit you? If you're God, tell us who hit you." And they're just mocking him. He's up on the cross and people are saying, "If you're God, come down." I mean, they're just mocking him. And Sanballat had been mocking them even before they were building, but in chapter 4, he takes it up a notch. Now, you ever face ridicule at work? I mean, I'm sure we all have, right? Or at different times, some have better jobs than others for certain, but I think people tend to ridicule things when their place in life feels threatened. Whether they're threatened, whether your good work, your hard work threatens their laziness, or your faith threatens their godlessness, or whatever the case may be, ridicule is birthed out of insecurity, about other people feeling insecure. And by the way, if you probably noticed, if ridicule and anger don't work, people take it up a level, and they move to threats. Verse 7 and 8, that's what Sanballat does. It says, "But when Sanballat and Tobiah and the Arabs, Ammonites, and Ashdodites heard that the work was going ahead and that the gaps in the wall of Jerusalem were being repaired, they were furious. They made plans to come and fight against Jerusalem and throw us into confusion." So, I mean, we've all experienced external discouragement, and most of us are aware of this. And again, I don't think I taught you anything new. We all know what it feels like at work or in life or in relationships to experience external sources of discouragement. The problem is we tend to ignore the other source, which is actually a way bigger issue. Most discouragement that we face, most discouragement comes from within. And I don't think anybody's shocked when people are mean. I don't think anybody's shocked when discouragement comes from without. But when it starts to rise up inside of us, so many of us just get paralyzed. It's like we don't know what to do with it. And the thing is, when we experience it from without, opposition from outside can lead to discouragement on the inside. That's what we see here. We see these guys just ridiculing and criticizing and threatening. And in verse 10, we see internal discouragement start to set in. In verse 10, it says this: "Then the people of Judah began to complain. The workers are getting tired and there's so much rubble to be moved. We'll never be able to build this wall by ourselves." And then meanwhile, it says our enemies, they keep laying it on. Our enemies were saying, before they know what's happening, we'll swoop down on them and we'll kill them and end their work. "The Jews who live near the enemy came and told us again and again, they will come from all directions and attack us." Now, I want you to pause. I want to rewind for a few verses. I want you to see this, what's going on. This starts happening. Look what's happening in verse 6. It says, "At last the wall was completed to half its height around the entire city, for the people had worked with enthusiasm." I want to key in on that phrase, half its height. People are working away. They're working with enthusiasm. They start talking, smack from the outside. They start giving them a hard time, but they're working away, and the wall gets to half its height. And about that time, that's when the external stuff starts getting to them, and internal discouragement sets in. You ever noticed at work when you get a new project, like the beginning of that new project's really, really fun? Or you ever notice when you quit a job and you get a new job, how good that new job seems? For like the first week or two, you're like, this place is awesome. They have a cappuccino machine. This is like the best place on earth. I can't believe, why did I work at that other place so long? This is so amazing. What happens to that job like 6 months down the road? It's a job. Like it's boring and routine, and it's easy to fall into the rut and become discouraged and be like, same old cappuccinos. You just get an attitude. It just happens. Now, this is dangerous because internal discouragement has a pattern it goes through. Internal discouragement starts with fatigue. It's when you get tired. It's when you get sick of it. In verse 10, it says the workers are getting tired, or literally the strength of the laborers is giving out. They'd been working hard. They'd been putting themselves completely in this, and they needed rest. Listen, when you're physically drained, how easy is it to become discouraged about the slightest thing? I love the quote of famous football coach Vince Lombardi. He said, "Fatigue makes cowards of us all." Fatigue makes cowards of us all. If your job, if a situation in your life, whatever it is, has you worn out, watch out. Because fatigue leads to discouragement. When you're physically tired, when you're worn down, it is almost impossible to be emotionally or spiritually up. You can't burn the candle at both ends for very long before you just wear down. And sometimes the most spiritual thing that you can do is go to bed early and get some rest. Now, not right now. I don't mean fall asleep during the sermon. So if somebody does that, get a little bit of this going on. But listen, fatigue is dangerous because fatigue, if left unchecked, can lead to frustration. And we see that in verse 10. It says, "And the people of Judah begin to complain, the workers are getting tired," there's the fatigue, and there is so much rubble to be moved. Here's the frustration. We'll never be able to build a wall by ourselves. This is the same crew who is working with all their hearts. And the same thing can happen to us. You ever worked at something at work, and no matter how much you get done, you never feel like you make any progress? In ministry, we say it this way: it's Monday, but Sunday's coming, right? There's always another Sunday. There's always another sermon. There's always another, and it feels like it's never done. And they became overwhelmed. They start looking around. There's rubble. They got the wall half up. There's rubble everywhere, and it was frustrating. By the way, rubble is anything in your life that keeps you from accomplishing your goal or God's goal for your life. So let me ask you a question. What is your rubble? What is it that's keeping you from accomplishing God's goal for your life? What is it that distracts you? Think about your workplace right now. What eats away at your most productive time? Or maybe I should say, who eats away at your most productive time? Because it's probably somebody, a coworker or somebody that stops by and you're just, hey, this is great. That will happen until you do something about it. That's why the author of Hebrews issues this challenge in Hebrews 12, verse 1. Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a huge crowd of witnesses to the life of faith, let us strip off every weight that slows us down, especially the sin that easily trips us up, and let us run with endurance the race God has before us. In the NIV, it says, let us throw off everything that hinders. Listen, I don't know what the rubble is in your life. I don't know what you're dealing with at your job. Maybe at work you feel completely overwhelmed. Maybe it seems like the rubble just never goes away. You accomplish one task and then there's another one. You solve one problem and then there's another one. And people are expecting more and more and more of you, while at the same time giving less and less and less. And before long you're frustrated and you're irritable. Whatever it is, you've got to learn to deal with that frustration, because if you don't, frustration leads to something dangerous. Frustration often leads to fear. And by the way, fear is where we become a little bit irrational, okay? Fatigue leads to frustration, and frustration leads to fear, and then we get irrational. Verse 11, it says, meanwhile, our enemies were saying, before they know what's happening, we'll swoop down on them and kill them and end their work. Now listen, the Jews who live near the enemy came and told us again and again, they will come from all directions and attack us. Now notice who gets scared here. It's the Jews living where? Near the enemy. Those most affected by fear are those who live closest to the pessimistic people. If you want to avoid, you limit the depressing thoughts that you're bringing into your work life, it's best not to hang around with the negative Nellies at your work. There's an old saying, if you want to soar with the eagles, you can't spend time running around with the turkeys. Like, you can't. It just, and yet we do this. And people, they're negative and they're critical and they're, all this, and it causes us to be kind of lose that sense of security, and we become afraid. And fear takes us beyond discouragement, actually, to deception. Here's what I mean. In his book, Scared to Life, Douglas Rumford cites a study that shows why we shouldn't let fear run our lives. He said, think about all the fears in your life. 60% of your fears, totally unfounded. Like, not even based in reality. Like, they're not going to happen, okay? I'm scared of snakes on a plane. It's not going to happen, right? 20% of your fears are about something that happened in the past. So there's nothing you can do about it. 10% of your fears are so small that they don't actually make a difference. They just feel scary. 5% of your fears are real, but you actually don't have any control. You can't do anything about them. There's nothing you can do. So that leaves us with a whopping 5% that are real fears that we can actually do anything about. And yet, Satan will use these fears in our lives, these irrational fears. Nehemiah's enemies were doing all they could. They ridiculed and they criticized and they threatened, and the Jewish people were getting worn down, and they begin to feel scared, and fear leads them past rational thought to a place where they buy into a lie that we all buy into. We'll never be able to do it. We can't do it. So what do you do when you get to that place? What do you do about it? Well, that leads to our second lesson. You can't defeat discouragement alone. You can't. You can't do it alone. I want to back up all the way to verse 4 and 5. Remember in Nehemiah 4, 1 through 3, Sanballat and Tobiah had started, with the ridiculing and all of that. Watch Nehemiah's response in verse 4. Then I prayed. There's a lot to learn right there, isn't there? Then I prayed, hear us, O God, for we are being mocked. May their scoffing fall back on their own heads, and may they themselves become captives in a foreign land. Do not ignore their guilt. Do not blot out their sins, for they've provoked you to anger here in front of the builders. Listen, when discouragement comes, I want you to hear this. It's okay to ask for help. It's okay to ask for help. Nehemiah starts by turning to God in prayer. Now, I can't speak for you, but I know when I face opposition, do you know where the first place I go is? I get angry and defensive. Right? I start putting up my walls, and what if instead, when somebody ridicules us, what if instead of our first response being to get angry, what if it was to get on our knees and to seek God in prayer? God, do you hear what this person's saying about me? Here's things I'm feeling inside, but God, you're sovereign. Prayer reminds us that God is in control even over those who are attacking us. I want you to notice when Nehemiah prays. This takes incredible self-control. He's ridiculed, and he prays before acting. When discouragement comes, when attack comes, like he doesn't give up and throw in the towel. He doesn't give a pep talk to the workers. He doesn't organize raiding parties against the enemies. He doesn't create propaganda to try to put a spin on things. He doesn't post passive-aggressive comments on Facebook and Twitter. Hello? We all have to read it too. Please stop doing it, okay? But there's a great principle to lock onto here. When people talk against you, don't talk back. Instead, talk to God. When people talk against you, and they will, listen, they will, because they're insecure. Don't talk back. Instead, talk to God. You say, so what, all I do is pray? Well, no, it doesn't mean you don't have a part to play. Look at verse 9. But we prayed to our God and guarded the city day and night to protect ourselves. So it says we prayed and we posted guard. There's two things going on here. God's part and our part. Martin Luther says it this way. He says, pray as if everything depends on God, and then work as if everything depends on you. And that's the juxtaposition here. When the enemy starts calling, Nehemiah continues to pray, and he's praying, and the workers are still working. And so there's this blending of faith and action. It's this partnership of heaven and earth. And watch what happens in verse 15 to 17. When our enemies heard that we knew of their plans and that God had frustrated them, we all returned to our work on the wall. But from then on, only half my men worked, while the other half stood guard with spears, shields, bows, and coats of mail. The leaders stationed themselves behind the people of Judah who were building the wall. Now watch, this is my favorite. The laborers carried on their work with one hand supporting their load and one hand holding a weapon. Can you see it? They're building the wall, brick in one hand, or stone in one hand, sword in the other. And that's how they rebuilt the rest of the wall. Here's my point. When we talk about God saving us, is salvation something that's by grace or by works? Grace, right? For by grace you are saved through faith, not of works, not of something you did so that no one can boast. We didn't earn it. It's given to us free. But listen, here's where we get mistaken. Just because salvation is not by works doesn't mean as a Christian you never have to work at things. The lie that Satan gets us to believe, well, I'm saved, I shouldn't have to do anything. This should just be easy all the time. You ever found that in your Christian life? That working out for anybody? God did not put a bubble around us. We still live in the real broken world. Just because salvation's not by works doesn't mean that Christians, you don't have to work at things, that some things aren't going to be hard. Listen, they were as prepared, these are God's people, they were as prepared for war as they were for work. We must understand that. Throughout the chapter, we see this over and over. We see this. We prayed, and then we acted. We prayed, and then. We prayed, and then. Prayer and action, hand in hand. Doing God's will. So, what does this look like in the workplace? Well, let me give you two practical takeaways that hopefully you can apply to your workplace, if not to your workplace, to your home, to your family, to your marriage, to whatever. First, when you come up against things and you feel discouraged, reorganize your priorities. Well, what if it's not my fault? It is. At least to some extent, right? I mean, here's the reality. Even when it's somebody else's fault, can you control them? No. Have you tried? Yes. Did it work? No. But what can you control in that situation? Me. Right? So here's what I mean by reorganizing my priorities. Look at verse 13. So I placed armed guards behind the lowest parts of the wall in the exposed areas. I stationed the people to stand guard by families, armed with swords, spears, and bows. So Nehemiah puts guards where? Where they're most vulnerable. So when you come up against attack, when you're feeling discouraged, when you're feeling down, what's one thing that you should do? Put guards where you feel most vulnerable. Let me give you some examples. Let's say you're feeling like your marriage is under attack. Should you keep that to yourself? No. You should find trusted couples that you can share with, and the two of you can share, and they can mentor you and walk you through it. Get counseling if you need it. If you're struggling, if the reason you're struggling is because of pornography or faithfulness issues, get some accountability in your life. Bottom line, fight for your marriage. Pray for your marriage, and then fight for your marriage. Does that make sense? If you're in a job and you're just like, the boss doesn't understand, he doesn't listen, I just want to quit. You know what most people do? Yeah, they quit. Studies show that the average 40-year-old male has already had between 8 to 10 jobs, careers, because I'm done. I don't want to deal with that. What if you sat down with your boss and you said, hey, give me some critical feedback. Tell me where I can get better. How can I improve? Where am I not giving 100%? And you just say, I know my boss is half the issue, right? But I can't work on it. I got to work on me. You have a problem in your faith? Here's what a lot of people do. They're desperate for hope, and they come to Jesus, and they put their faith in Jesus, and then life is still tough. And they're like, well, that didn't work. I'm done. What if you reorganize your schedule so you can begin to spend time with him every morning? What if you came to church more, not less? What if you went to a life group instead of saying, I don't have time? What if you get into his word and start to pray and start to memorize scripture? What if you prayed and then do something about it? Does that make sense? So reorganize your priorities because it's the only thing you can control. And then second, remember who God is. This is so huge. I hope you hear the hope in this. Remember who God is. Look at verse 14. Put yourself in Nehemiah's shoes. Everything that's happening, the enemy's criticizing, everybody's given up hope. He says, then as I looked over the situation, as I looked at everything falling apart, he said, I called together the nobles and the rest of the people, and I said to them, do not be afraid. Don't be afraid of the enemy. He said, remember the Lord, who is great and glorious, and fight for your brothers, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your homes. He says, don't be afraid. Remember, guys, do you remember who God is? He said, I just looked over the situation. I know how bad it is, but even in the midst of all this discouragement, remember who God is. He reminded them, God is God. Success or failure has never been on your shoulders. It's never been dependent on you. It's dependent on God. Verse 10 was right. They couldn't build a wall on their own, but they never had to. They were never expected to. And if you got stuff like that in your life, I can't do it. God's saying, I know. You were never expected to. Why are you trying to do that yourself? I don't know about you. It's easy for me to forget. It's easy for me to get caught in life with my eyes in the rubble. It's easy for me to get lost in the responsibilities of life. Now let me ask you a question. When they started building the walls that had been broken down, was there rubble there? Yeah, everywhere, absolutely, right? Nothing changed when the wall got to half its height. The only thing that changed, listen, was their focus. That's the only thing that changed. They stopped looking to God, and they started focusing on the rubble. And when you stop focusing on God and you start focusing on the rubble in your life, of course your world's falling apart. Whatever you're facing at your work, whatever you're facing in your home, whatever you're facing in your marriage, whatever you're facing in your life, ask yourself, where am I focused? Do you need to be reminded that He is enough? That He is always there for me? That He's great and He's awesome and He's bigger than my problems? He's the reason we can keep on fighting. He's the reason we keep breathing. He's the reason we have breath in our lungs. He's the reason we work and we work well. And so when you're down and you're having a bad day at work or you're having a bad day at home or whatever, you need to remember that He is bigger and He is faithful and He will never leave you or forsake you. Ever.